Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to wherever you are tuning in from in the world. Thank you for joining us for this GLF live session. My name is Natasha Elkington, and I'll be your host and moderator for today, where the topic of our conversation is banking on our future with seeds. So what we're going to be talking about is about seed banks and seed repositories, also known as gene banks, that mitigate the risks of future food crises by ensuring a healthy, stable, and diverse variety of crops that will be available when we most need them. The problem is many of the world's more than 1,700 gene banks are vulnerable to natural disasters, war, social unrest, infrastructure issues, or a simple lack of funds. So joining me today are two experts who are going to be talking to us about seeds and grains, gene banks, and how long-term funding and collaboration can help protect crop diversity and the food supply of the future. So please welcome Dr. Sarada Kishnan, Director of Programs at the Global Crop Diversity Trust. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Michael Abberton, Director of R4D in West Africa, also the Head of Genetic Resources Center at the IITA, the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, based in Ibadan, Nigeria. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
I hope I got all the words right and said everything correctly. Thank you. So why don't we just jump in, I guess, with Sarada. Maybe just tell us a bit about your position and, and your organization and what you do, just to give our audience a bit of a summary.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks, Natasha. Thanks for having me today. And I'm the Director of Programs with the Global Crop Diversity Trust. And the mission of the Global Crop Diversity Trust to ensure that crop diversity is conserved and made available for the future forever and also at a global scale. So we play a very unique role in the ex situ conservation of crop genetic resources. And what we do is, the way we do it is by providing, we have a long-term financing model that provides funding for critical gene bank operations. And we also provide technical support to strengthen the key pillars of the global system of gene banks. And we also do, what we do also raise awareness among public and private sector stakeholders about the importance of gene banks and conserving crop diversity.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Professor Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. So IITA is the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture. It has its headquarters in Ibadan, Nigeria, but it works across sub-Saharan Africa, and it's actually part of a wider consortium called the CIAT. So we're really focused on agricultural research for development, on poverty alleviation, and obviously on addressing malnutrition. So within IITA, I am the head, as you said, of the Genetic Resources Center or the Gene Bank. So we first of all conserve some of the major crops of sub-Saharan Africa: cassava, yams, bananas and plantains, cowpea, soybean, and maize. So we conserve that diversity, and we really try and also facilitate the use of that diversity.
Beautiful. Complicated, but very simplified. Thank you. So could you just share with us then, why are seed banks becoming increasingly more and more important to, create, conserve, protect at this point in where we are in humanity's timeline on this planet?
Okay, shall I go first?
Go first. Yeah.
So I think that we all know that we have some major challenges. We have climate change, of course, and we need to adapt to, as well as to try and mitigate. We have loss of biodiversity, and we have also, of course, these problems of poverty and malnutrition in many parts of the world, including many parts of Africa. Now, those challenges mean that we are facing new threats, for example, and we're basically seeing it on the news every day now about droughts, about floods, that type of thing. I think people are becoming familiar with. The other thing I would mention is that climate change and the movement of people around the world is also bringing more threats from pests and diseases, which are moving into new habitats. And we're seeing some very clear examples of that. So that all points to the need to, first of all, conserve the diversity of our major crops to have a good system in place for doing that, which includes national gene banks, other forms of seed storage, a good system in place, and also a good means of really facilitating the use. So, for example, we have more than 15,000 different types of cowpea in the IITA gene bank. We have cowpea breeding programs. Cowpea is a very important legume for sub-Saharan Africa. We have breeding programs, but they cannot utilize effectively 15,000 different types. So we have to do what we can by characterization, by work at the DNA level, to put together much smaller subsets, which are, give them the best chance, if you like, at finding some genes which are going to be useful for drought tolerance and for heat tolerance and for some of these other threats that we face.
Wow. So where are we in terms of protecting seeds, like globally, looking at all these threats and extreme weathers and where we are right now? Are we in a good position, you would say, or is there a long way to go at the moment in terms of the vulnerability? Where would you say we are at?
Yeah,
Sarada,
I'll leave that one to you. Yeah.
Over to me. Okay, yes, I think we still have a lot of work ahead of us because we have the international gene banks, which is IITA is part of the CG system, and the international gene banks, but they have these mandate crops. Those are the big crops that they're conserving. But there are so many within the countries itself, there are so many crops that are very locally, culturally important that are grown that are not in those big international gene banks. So those have to be conserved in the national gene banks. So every country has their own gene bank, and where they conserve the locally relevant crops. So, and a lot of the national gene banks are resource poor and poorly funded. And so a lot of the material that are in these gene banks are at high risk of being lost. And so, yes, so we have a long ways to go in ensuring that all the gene banks are up to standards and conserving at these standards.
Right. So is there like a global like umbrella that makes sure that these gene banks are in order? Is this what you're trying to create now, these collaborations and long-term partnership agreements to ensure this?
Yeah, that's what the Crop Trust does, is we work with the CG centers. So we have an endowment fund that provides funding for the essential operations of a gene bank. And through projects with funding that we get separately that does not go into the endowment fund, we have projects with our national partners. We work with the National Agriculture Research System to ensure that that we build capacity through quality management system training, information system training, and as well as capacity building through some equipment and infrastructure development, and providing training to staff on how to conserve. And also, so that's where we are working through projects. We work with our national partners. So there is a lot. I mean, we have so many national gene banks, but it is one step at a time. So what we call the Global Gene Bank Partnership. So through our Global Gene Bank Partnership, we also work with Michael and the IITA, because for a lot of the Nigerian National Gene Bank that we are working with, the IITA is a local resource that they have that because there is so much knowledge and expertise at IITA, and so we can utilize that to provide training to national gene banks, so within that African region.
Great. And I guess why I'm speaking to you today is because, the approach that you're taking is, it's proving to be successful and favorable in terms of conserving and protecting these gene banks. Do you want to tell us a bit more on that?
Yeah, I'll turn it to Michael or to us.
Whoever feels like jumping in and thinks they want to.
Go ahead, Michael.
Okay, let me say something. I think we have, as Sarada was saying, within the CG, we have a system which is basically conserving, making accessible the major staple crops of the world between the different centers. We do a lot of distribution to all manner of partners who are doing breeding, either within the CG, outside, other researchers, etc. But of course, there's always a need to be able to keep that investment going, to keep that awareness of the necessity of these things going. There's always that danger of really not being able to keep up with the demands that we have. So we need that investment to be coming. And as Sarada says, we also need to be able to do more. The vast majority of crops are conserved by national gene banks, not by the CG. We work with a number within West and Central Africa. We have a network with ourselves, with some other CG centers and national gene banks. There's a need for investment. The national governments themselves also need to be actually investing more into these resources, because they are important for the future of agriculture in their own countries, of course. And we have to realize, and I think it's probably in some ways that those biodiversity aspects, which are actually crucial to the future of our food production, that loss of biodiversity that we're seeing has not been given the same attention as, for example, climate change. But they are actually two sides of the same coin in a way, in that they have that interaction, and they do both affect, very severely the future in terms of agriculture, in terms of food production.
Yeah, because I was just going to ask, what is the interest out there in terms of investors, and governments, with seed banks? This whole crisis that we're in, we were all in it. It's like we're in the eye of the storm, or we're right in the middle of the volcano. Everything is burning. We can see it's happening all around us. It looks like, corporations might be taking advantage of the situation. Right now, there's a greenwashing. There's a lot of chaos going on at the moment, but I think we need to be level-headed and think about things more simplified. So what is the reaction or engagement from investors or governments in terms of protecting seed banks and gene banks? Is it you can tell me.
Yeah, funding is always the hard thing, right? Because there are so many competing priorities. And for a donor to have to prioritize something, and a lot of the donors want to see direct impact. And when it comes to conservation, it's conservation of seeds, which it's for the long term. It's not immediate, because, without the conservation of seeds, you're not going to, the potential for looking for genes that are adapted to climate change, for drought tolerance or pest or disease resistance. Because without those genetic resources, you're not going to have that pipeline for breeding programs. And so, but then people want immediate results. And so that has been the challenge in raising funds. And so we have a campaign to raise our endowment fund, because we want to fund all the gene banks. But until we get funds into the endowment fund, we are not able to give the money that we want to all the gene banks. So yeah, we have started a campaign. We will be starting a campaign soon to raise additional money to our endowment fund. So hopefully, once all the international gene banks, all the essential operations are covered, we can then start funding all the national gene banks as well.
Great. Because I think when we spoke earlier, just in terms maybe to give our audience direct examples of where gene banks have worked, why are you pushing to conserve this? Like you said, you can't show it immediate action, but like I interviewed Eliane Balijoro, this DG for C4 the other day, and she was telling me about the Rwanda genocide and how it was the seed banks, conserving those that actually helped them in the future. I don't know, maybe you could give us more examples, just for our audience, just to understand why we're sitting here talking about seed banks and gene banks, and why is it important, for them to directly identify with it.
Yeah, sure. So I think the key thing is that diversity, as I mentioned. It is being used now, for example, within the breeding programs to produce new varieties which are more climate resilient, more nutritious. There are good examples of, as I said, pests and diseases which are moved around, fall armyworm into West Africa, a major threat to maize lethal necrosis in East Africa. Likewise, where this diversity has been required. We were also involved in sort of COVID recovery in a number of countries within West Africa, again supplying some of that material which was needed. So that's gene bank material, but also material from the breeders that was needed to restart agriculture. In the past, we've had severe flooding again, some parts of Nigeria, and had to supply. So I think those are all ongoing. The key thing is to be able to really conserve effectively and in a very good condition that diversity, to be able to keep it in different places so it's not so much threatened by being in one place, and to do everything we can to make it more available for use by really doing a very good job in terms of characterizing it, in terms of putting it into subsets so it's there. And we work very closely with a number of the breeders to achieve that. So there is, in a lot of cases, this requirement for diversity going into the breeding program. So I think that's really the key to it. We don't know what exactly is going to come along in the future. We can work with the climate change models. We can show that, drought in the north of Nigeria, of course, going into the Sahel. And when we think about those regions, we can see the importance of being able to develop a more resilient agriculture. You only have to look on the news at those countries in the region of the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, that we need to do everything we can to be able to develop the agriculture that we have in those regions. So I think this is all part of what we need to do. It's about conserving that diversity and harnessing the diversity, and also thinking about the other crops. So in the gene bank here in IITA, we have a number of what we call underutilized crops. Sometimes people talk about orphan crops, which have a lot. They are grown in Africa. They have a lot more potential. We can think of Bambara groundnut, African yam bean, wing bean. They have a lot more potential to develop systems. We need to be thinking about the systems which are going to be more climate resilient and also more nutritious, because those are the two real main challenges that we have.
And maybe more specifically, I can give a couple of specific examples through our Crop Wild Relatives project, which we ran for 10 years, which has now become the BOLD project. So we collected and conserved wild relatives of our crops, many different species in gene banks. And one of the results of that project was the release of a durum wheat variety in collaboration with IITA gene bank, which is a sister gene bank to one of the CG centers in Morocco and Lebanon. It's called the Jabal wheat variety, which was just released last year. And it is one of the highly drought tolerant. It has a wild relative from Syria, the genes from Syrian wild relative that was incorporated into this wheat variety. And it was in farmer trials before it was released. There were 3 years of farmer trials that were done where farmers were able to look at the results of the growth potential of this specific variety. And in farmer trials, serendipitously, it so happened that the 3 years that it was in the field, they were all drought years. And of all the varieties that were planted, this was the one that survived. And so that made farmers immediately adopt, because it also has to be, when you do research, have to have farmer participatory research. So that way you get the buy-in from farmers, because rather than you develop a variety and give it to the farmers, you need to make sure that they are involved along the way for easy adoption. And another example is a potato variety called methyled potato through the SIP gene bank, developed in collaboration with the SIP gene bank, utilizing another wild relative of potato. And that is highly resistant to early blight of potato, late blight of potato, which, as you may know, was the one that caused the Irish potato famine. And so that one is resistant. So utilizing genes from the wild relatives of our crop ones, developing new varieties so this is the whole potential of crop diversity, utilizing them to develop new resistances or tolerances.
Great. So then I guess, like we have a question from the audience, asking about the other side of the coin in terms of, how about cloning crops? Are these ongoing projects? So the opposite side of using our relatives, making different offspring. How does that tie into this whole crop diversity conversation?
Well, cloning, I think, but by cloning, there are the way to look, not all crops can be conserved as seeds. So there are the sweet potatoes and potatoes, they have to be conserved clonally. So then you propagate them clonally and you conserve them. So I'm not sure if the question was on the conservation of clonal crops.
I don't know. It's just like, how about clone crops? Are they an ongoing project? That was it.
Let me say, Natasha, again, in IITA, we have very major crops which are, as Sarada said, clonally propagated. If you think of cassava, that's propagated through the stem, yam, through the tuber, banana. So we are conserving those, but not as seed. So they are conserved in the field, but also as tissue culture, and increasingly also in what we call the cryobank. That's very, very, very low temperature conservation for the long term. So yes, we mustn't think that everything is seed. Most of the crops and most of the gene banks in the world, yes, most of it is seed, but we also have these clonal crops where we are conserving the actual clone of those and not seed, and that's an important part of what we are doing, because many of these are actually very important crops, and they're also less important but still important root and tuber crops as well. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. Yes.
I did have a question though, just for some of us who are not in the field, understanding how these gene banks work. What are the costs of putting these gene banks up? Does it just vary with the type of seeds you're collecting, or like is it like because does every country have them? Like is it a simple thing to do, or
Sarada.
Well, it is, it does vary by how elaborate your seed bank is. I mean, for basically, you need freezer. So you need a medium-term freezer and a long-term freezer. So the long-term is once you put it in there, you only take it every few years to ensure that the viability of the seeds is still, it's still viable. So, and then the medium-term is where you then distribute, because you always, gene banks, the main purpose of the gene bank is to make sure that you're distributing the seeds to users, because the seeds need to be used. So you have the long-term and the medium-term conservation. And then also what you have to do is the seeds are not going to live forever. They have a certain period of viability. And so you need to test the viability of seeds every 5 years, or whatever for each crop it varies. And so you need facilities to do the viability testing, and you need field to do regeneration. So if the viability is lower than 85%, then you need to take the seeds out and regenerate. So you have to take it to the field, grow them out, and then collect the seeds and then put them back. And so it's not a museum. Like, you don't think of seed banks as museums where you put the seed and you forget about it in the freezer and that's it. No, because it is it's always alive, and it's a process that you need to be always doing. So if you have thousands of accessions, so you have to have a periodic testing, because you can't put all 1,000 in the field to regenerate at the same time. So you have to have planning to go with it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Just to add, I think the key thing is, gene banks are not a project. There has to be sustainability. There has to be that long-term investment. That's the whole nature of a seed bank. It has to be long-term. We are dealing with some gene banks, seed banks in Africa, where this is a major issue, and some of those basic things are actually difficult to achieve in terms of reliable power, etc., etc., etc. So there are challenges there, but there has to be that sustainability. And the other thing I want to mention is, the data side is very important. So we're getting data on these, the different, what we call accessions, the different types of seed, etc., that's in there. And that's also very, very important. We're getting data from where it comes from, we're characterizing it, that again is part of what makes it useful. So the whole data side and bringing in the use, when we start to get data on the DNA level differences, that's important to give more information to requesters, to people who want the germplasm, so we can be, if you like, more helpful to them in terms of what they might need to use this for.
Great. So I mean, I guess we're coming to the end of our chat. We're learning all about seeds and gene banks, and like, I don't know if there's anything you think that's important that we haven't covered that you'd like our audience to know about, you know, the work you do, and why they should know it's important, you know, the hard work that you're putting into, you know, save and conserve these gene banks.
I think, I mean, the seeds, this crop diversity is the fundamental for any crop improvement. It is fundamental that we tap into this crop diversity. So it is so important that we conserve this crop diversity. And to conserve it, we need funding. So I think the important thing is it is the basic need of our food system, our agri-food system. The basic need is the crop diversity and the conservation of that crop diversity.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Professor Michael.
Yeah, I think, of course, I agree with that. That is a diversity that is crucial for the future. You know, these threats are only becoming stronger in terms of climate change, in terms of the loss of biodiversity, in terms of the need to actually, you know, increase productivity in a lot of cases, but without having any detrimental effects on the environment, on soils, etc. So most certainly we are going to need the seed that's in these gene banks even more in the future, and we're going to need to develop better, more modern approaches to actually getting at that variation and utilizing it.
So are you hopeful for the future, like with the current status quo that you're in right now, right? With the work that's currently going on? Or does it look like we're all just going to be, we're hoping we get there? It's a long drag.
And it's a collaborative effort. You know, it's not
Right.
just the gene banks working on their own with funding from the crop trust, but it is like public sector, private sector, farmers, research community, civil society. We need all of us to be involved in this endeavor to ensure that we protect this crop diversity.
I mean, I think it's difficult in a way. We appreciate that, you know, many governments, they have so many calls on their budget, but yes, we can be hopeful. I think we need to see governments investing more in their seed banks with the support that they can get from the crop trust, with the help from the CG centers. But we actually need to see more sustainable funding. As I said, it's not a project. It needs to be a plan for the funding into the future.
Great. I have one last question from our audience. Well, two. One is, how can we make sure that the genetic resources are distributed following the values of fairness and equality? And then the last one is, how do gene banks connect with the regenerative agriculture movement? Maybe I can give you one and then we can end there. The first one is, how can we make sure that genetic resources are distributed following the values of fairness and equality? Good question.
Yeah, I can say something briefly. You know, the gene banks, for example, the ones we have within the CGIAR, we operate under something called the International Treaty, Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. I don't have time to go into too much of that, but that's a very important instrument, if you like, of policy, which says how we can go about the exchange of material and how some of that benefit can actually go back to the farmers, because that is a very important question, that the farmers have been custodians of this diversity for thousands of years. They need to see some benefit. So there is, it's not perfect, it's still evolving, but there is a system there under the international treaty that we follow. For example, all our seed goes entirely free to the requester for their use, connected with food security. The data goes along with it. So, but there's a sort of requirement also to keep that going, to keep it open. So there has been a lot of concern for those issues. As I say, it's not perfect and the system is still evolving.
Great, thank you. I guess for you, Sarada, you can maybe this last question. How do gene banks connect with the regenerative agriculture movement?
Oh, because, a lot of